I think we're going to start with a little history that goes back before the book to put this in context on why we have a city charter and why the book was written. I first was asked to write it in 1979 when there was a very major charter revision process, and subsequently rewrote it to reflect other charter revision processes. It's interesting that New York City, we think it's always been here. It's part of everyone's history. And we think New York City has always been the major city in the United States. In fact, New York City really didn't become the city that we know until 1898. Prior to that, New York City was Manhattan, and in 1874, part of the Bronx, part of that northern area was access to Manhattan, and that became a city, and it received a city charter. That's what I'm going to concentrate on today, is the city charter, because the city charter is our constitution. And it's a document that is alive and growing and changing. And without giving, I think it's become an absolutely marvelous model document for how to run a city. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it started and how it built up, and then Marco's going to fill us in on where we are now. But when the city had a charter in the 1870s, it wasn't the city of New York as we know it now. It had a mayor, it had a controller, it had a board of aldermen, and it had something called the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. Now, this for me was a revelation, I must say. I've been writing about the Board of Estimate for 45 years. I never knew why it was called the Board of Estimate. And I guess I wasn't curious enough to find out. It was the Board of Estimate. It was part of New York City government. Now that I think about it, it hasn't been in effect since 1989. So I hope some of you know that there was a Board of Estimate, and it was a very powerful body. I found out yesterday in doing some late research that the Board of Estimate was originally in the 1870s called the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. And that meant that the responsibility of the board was to estimate the needs of city agencies and then apportion the city funds among the city agencies. I never knew that. I think that's fascinating. And that was what it did. It was very powerful. It remained powerful until it was discontinued in 1989 for a reason which will become apparent as we go on. But the city became the city as we know it, with 5 boroughs, and it became an entity in 1898. In 1894, the residents of the area of those 5 boroughs voted to consolidate the city. Basically, it was an economy of scale. They thought they could be more successful as a larger city. They could create more infrastructure. They wanted to improve the transportation systems. They had these marvelous ports, but Chicago was beating them in commerce, and they weren't getting World's fairs. They thought they could do better as a city. The residents of all 5 boroughs voted to approve the consolidation of the city in 1894. The mayors of New York and Brooklyn didn't like that very much, but the residents wanted it. One of the reasons that I read about was that Brooklyn was running out of water and New York had an excess. So that was there were different reasons that it came along. Actually, Brooklyn had been a city. By 1860, Brooklyn was the 3rd largest city in the United States, but they were still willing to merge with New York for commercial purposes. They had different politics. Some people say Brooklyn was Protestant and Republican, and New York was Catholic and Tammany Hall, Democrats. But they merged to form this great city. And in the process of merging, they formed a government which consisted of a mayor, a board of aldermen, who were local representatives, a president of the board of aldermen, and a controller, and this board of estimate, which consisted of the mayor, the controller, the president of the board of estimate, and the 5 borough presidents. Each borough president had 1 vote. The 3 citywide elected officials had 2. Interesting mix. This was a voluntary merger, but we have the the president of the borough of Brooklyn with 1 million people in 1898, and the president of the borough of Richmond, because it was Richmond, it didn't become Staten Island officially until 1975, each having one vote. Largest borough, smallest borough, each had one vote. That apparently was not an issue at that time. At that time. The city operates under a city charter. Every city in New York has a city charter. And the city charter, as opposed to the Constitution of the state of New York, can be amended by the citizens in an initiative and referendum process. We've amended our city charter a number of times in New York without going to the legislature. As long as we stay within our grounds, we can amend the charter. You cannot amend the Constitution or the law in New York unless a member of the legislature introduces the legislation. It has to be approved by both houses of the state legislature and in 2 separately elected state legislative terms, and then it goes to the voters. We do not have a possibility for citizens to initiate change in state constitution. In the state of New York, we do have it in the city, as does every other city in New York. The city charter, the Board of Estimate, which in 1938 they took off the name apportionment, and just called it the Board of Estimate, was a singular power in the city of New York. Up until 1988, the charter says that the Board of Estimate is responsible for all the streets of New York and everything above and below them. So you want to build a building, you want to put up a bridge, you want to put up traffic signals, you want to get a permit, you want to get a franchise, you want to get a building code change. It all had to go through the Board of Estimate. Again, not an equally not a body that was equal in power for voters around the city, but it was a very crucial part of the city. And just for an aside, because I live in Queens, and I was sort of amused initially when they were putting together this city. There was thought that the 2 western counties of the western towns of Nassau County, the town of Hempstead and the town of Oyster Bay, would also become part of the city of New York. They soon found out that the people in Oyster Bay and Hempstead were not interested, and that merger did not go through. But and that body stayed pretty much intact. In 1939, they did away with the Board of Aldermen and they created the City Council. That was the first time we had a city council, but that Board of Estimate with the unequal vote remained in place. And the city charter talked a lot about city planning, the responsibilities of office holders, not so much about finances. I don't know where they thought the financial ends were going to be considered. And there were other city charter revisions. In 1963, the mayor got a lot more power. The city council got some more, and some was taken away from the borough presidents. And then the city got older and the infrastructure got older, and the city didn't have the money to pay for the maintenance and fixing up systems. Schools were overcrowded and were very run down. For people who lived in New York in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s, it was not a really pleasant place to be. Graffiti was on everything. And the city didn't have money. The first thing that happened was the state legislature allowed the city to institute a sales tax in the mid-60s to raise some money. And they did, but the city was still in dire financial straits. And there were really no financial controls in place. I mean, something as simple as the city should follow accepted accounting practices was something the city of New York never heard about. That was not something. The controller of the city of New York became the mayor of the city of New York, but that didn't straighten things out. And the city was really in very bad shape. And the governor and the legislature in New York decided there should be another Charter Revision Commission. And the Charter Revision Commission should look at 2 things. It should look at democratizing city government and getting more community involvement in feeling that if the people of the city had invested and worked in the city, they would be more committed to it, and things might get better. And the other was to get some financial control of what was going on with the city budget. So the legislature and the governor appointed a charter revision commission. It was a New York State Charter Revision Commission of the New York City city charter. The members were appointed by the state legislature, but they were basically all city residents. The commission was chaired by a Republican. We had a Republican governor at that time. The commission was chaired by a Republican state senator named Roy Goodman, if any of you have heard that name. And they set about to work, and they worked for 3 years to come up with a real significant change in city government. And they created community boards, 59 community boards. There had been community boards in Manhattan, but not in the other boroughs. So the commission proposed community boards in each borough, and things we now take for granted: district service cabinets, lines that are coterminous for services in districts. All of that was really thought of in the 79. And the idea was to bring services closer to people, to make people feel that they had an investment in the services that were provided in the city. We were losing population, and we had no money. So this commission worked for 3 years. And the administration of the city was vehemently opposed to the commission. And the proposals, the mayor and even some good government groups said, we can't afford that. There's no way we cannot afford to implement the changes that you're suggesting. Other things were, they said the city can't do day-to-day spending in capital budget. The city was financing day-to-day expenses through the capital budget up to that point. And many groups were opposed. They felt this was overwhelming and too much. Well, two things happened. In 1975, the year that they were going to pass this referendum was coming up for a vote. 5 days before Election Day, the President of the United States, if anybody remembers or has heard about it, the President of the United States said, if New York City goes bankrupt, we're not giving them a dime. And the legislature started forming budget commissions and the Municipal Assistance Commission. And New Yorkers suddenly saw they were losing control of their city. And Election Day came, and the voters of New York City overwhelmingly passed 6 of the 10 amendments that were proposed. And that was the beginning of the modern, I say modern because they actually were looking at systems. This was before the internet. This was before you could go on your computer and find anything. The city charter was a book, a bound book, and then they'd have to rebind it. They didn't change it often. It was not kept up to date. I had one, and I went to a meeting, and I was sitting there with my charter, and the then president of the city council looked at me and she said, "You must be in the League of Women Voters." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Nobody else in New York would walk around with a copy of the city charter." It wasn't online. It wasn't accessible. People didn't know what the government, I don't know. I'm overwhelmed every day to think of how modern government can function and wonder how any other government ever functioned. And that is, I don't think we appreciate the openness that this did to, you can read the city charter. You put in New York City Charter, you can read it. Not only can you read it, it's now in plain English. So it's really a document you can read. We can amend it, and we amend it easily. And every amendment has made it more democratic, more open process, better rules of controlling the finances. And Marco's going to talk about that, but it just overwhelms me to think that we started with this book and document that I don't think anybody who worked in government read ever. I did it because we had a wonderful president of the League of Women Voters, a woman named Lynn Carver. I cite her all the time because I think she was revolutionary, from Staten Island. And she said, "Can we do a little pamphlet about how the city works?" And we tried to do it. And we did this booklet called "What Makes New York City Run" to really educate people on what the charter entailed and how you can impact on it. And we've had great impacts on it. We've changed the charter over the years. One thing I'm going to just mention, we can change the charter as long as the state lets us. And I think that's something we have to, we're a product of the state of New York. The law says we cannot pass laws that supersede state law or that counter state law. Sometimes the state can be very arbitrary in what they think is superseding or countering. About 10 years ago, we put in, a bill went up, city council passed a bill to ban plastic bags in New York City. And suddenly the state of New York said, you can't do that without our approval, and didn't want to give the approval for about 4 years. None of us understood exactly what that was. Maybe it was just the state legislature saying, you're not going to run everything, because I think New York State eventually banned plastic bags. We're a creature of the state, but we have a great deal of autonomy in how we run the city, and the body that is able to exercise that autonomy in many ways is the city council. The Board of Estimate eventually was eliminated, but why the Board of Estimate was eliminated. So that's the next part of the story.